Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia. Welcome back to another Mandate of Heaven Yellow Turban Reform Guide. This is part 3 of our 4-part series, and in this part we'll be covering the yellow and pink reforms. Previously, we have talked about the overall review structure and what they represent culturally in part 1, and in part 2 we look at the red and blue reform, and now in part 3 we'll look at the remaining 2 trees in the yellow and pink reform trees. Now, these 2 reform trees, as we covered earlier, represent the military power as well as military doctrine tree. And these will have 18 reforms in the military power and 15 reform in the military doctrine. Now, these add up to about 33 reforms. They're a little less than half of the 75 reforms total for the Yellow Turban factions in the Mandate of Heaven start. So there's not going to be a lot of reform to go over, but these definitely do carry a heavy weight as military is one of the main focuses of the Mandate of Heaven Yellow Turban gameplay. So in terms of how this guide will go, we will continue to use our 4 research time structure where we break the reforms down into 4-turn reforms, 6-turn reforms, 10-turn reforms, and 15-turn reforms, just to make the tree a little more clear. So starting out with military power, we can see here this is actually one of the more confusing trees to display in this pattern. On the left we have Yellow Sky Apprentice. That is the beginner reform for this branch, and everything like meditation with the other world, the way of the war, strict adherence to the way, and general of the flying stone all comes from Yellow Sky Apprentice, even though it's kind of presented in a confusing manner here just to save a little space. But after that point, most of the reforms on this tree will come from General of the Flying Stone, which is a critical reform for any Yellow Turban gameplay in Mandate of Heaven. Now moving on to military doctrine, we have military drill, which splits into regional factors and provincial coordinators, and then they branch out a little bit more with a steady focus on 10-turn and 15-turn reforms. These are pretty interesting. They provide some military bonuses as well as some building unlocks and some minor bonuses to campaign movement range. We'll talk about these once we break down the individual reforms. So as we're going to do the overview, we'll start back at military power, starting with the 4-turn reforms. So out of the 4-turn reforms, we mentioned already that the Yellow Sky Apprentice is your beginner reform. This is the reform which you need to unlock the entirety of the rest of the tree, as well as the 3 other 4-turn reforms that are shown here. And a common theme you're going to notice with military power is that with each reform, aside from enlightenment, which is basically prestige for Yellow Turbans, and maybe some bonuses like +1 starting rank for melee infantry recruit here on Yellow Sky Apprentice, every single military power reform will unlock a special Yellow Turban unit. And this is key, because if you don't get these reforms, you're going to be stuck using peasants and very low tier units in your campaign. Now, it's definitely possible to win your campaign with just peasants, as we are currently showing in our Zhangjiao Let's Play, but it's more fun to include more unit variety. It's going to make your gameplay a lot smoother, and you don't have to suffer huge casualties, even though it does work well with Zhangjiao. But perhaps you're playing the other 2 Zhang brothers, Zhang Liang and Zhang Bao, and you don't have the insane 25% bonus replenishment rate, so you have to fight more standard. Thus, these units will come into play. Now, there's going to be a full army composition guide as well as Yellow Turban unit tier list, so we're not really going to talk about how strong these individual units are, but generally speaking, you don't have very good units here in the 4-turn reforms. Units quality improve as the research time goes up, although it is worth noting that strict adherence to the way unlocks your faction unique unit. So Yellow Turban characters, they have a level 3 faction unique unit and a level 6 unlocked faction unique unit. The level 3 version, depending on which Zhang brother you're playing, will be unlocked at strict adherence to the way. So this is a pretty key reform if you have a powerful faction unique unit like the Messengers of Heaven here, displayed for Zhangjiao. Now, moving on, we have 6-turn reforms. Out of these, we just have to really touch on General of the Flying Stone. This one is critical. It is a lot of value for what it brings. So it gives you 30 points in enlightenment, which is amazing already for a 6-turn reform. That's going to boost your prestige and help you rank up for other bonuses like more army slots. And you get caltrops, which are great for all your infantry unit. They actually do a lot of damage in game, and you can definitely wait till some of your unit engage in combat before throwing these on top of the enemy units directly to ensure maximum damage. And lastly, the main reason why we get this reform, aside from getting the rest of the reform tree, because everything branches from this. Even Speaker of the Leader's Message branches from this reform right here, is that you get siege weapons. So trebuchets and multiple bolt crossbow. You guys probably already know how strong siege weapons are. They change the dynamics of the game by allowing attackers and defenders, doesn't matter which side you're on, if you outrange them with siege weapons, they will charge out at you, which is a huge advantage because you'll be able to have your range unit fire at the maximum amount of ammo. You don't have to move up to the enemy to trade fire. So very critical to get siege weapons. So General of the Flying Stone, definitely one of the earliest reform you should look at. Speaker of the Leader's Message, on the other hand, is quite interesting. It's another one of these reforms that will unlock your faction unique unit. This is the level 6 version. The Chosens of the 8 Immortals, or the Zhangjiao version of the unique unit is displayed here, but it doesn't matter which Zhang brother you play, your level 6 unlock will be on this reform. You'll also get +2 starting rank for Peasant Recruit, which is also very useful. Moving on, we have 10-turn reforms here. Now these are stacked in tiers, if you notice from the previous branch. So these 3 are the ones that branch directly from General of the Flying Stone, and there will be 3 more 10-turn reforms that branch from each of them. And here you notice not only do you get a unit, you also get a building unlock. So the only types of building that are unlocked from the military power reforms are military related ones, in this case Iron Mine and Horse Pasture. So there's 2 versions of the Iron Mine and there's 1 Horse Pasture. The level 4 unlocks are all provided here. You also get some nice cavalry unit. So if you are running one of these factions where your faction unique unit is not a cavalry, then here's where you will start to pick up some cavalry. Cavalry, once again, very strong in the game, very good at not only charging into a unit to rout them quickly, but also to chase down routed units to clean up in a battlefield. So these are all great bonuses. The -8% recruitment cost for a cavalry unit is also a nice touch on Children of the Earth. You can stack these with multiple Horse Pasture for a huge discount on your cavalry unit. And moving on, we have the next 3 10-turn reforms. These will branch from the previous 3 in respective orders. And the one that we really have to talk about is Faith and Magic. So Faith and Magic provides you with Stored Shield. This is one of the best frontline units for Yellow Turban factions, simply because they have good morale. They have the same stats as a heavy spear guard, and their shield blocks 80% of enemy range fire. They don't have formation access, but the 80% definitely makes up for that, and they're just a great quality frontline units, probably the best in the game. So that's definitely a reform you should look out for. The other units are slightly more aggressive. Perhaps you want to use them during ambushes, or peasants do fine. So the main reason to get the other 2 reform, Perfecting the Standard and Purity, is to continue down into the 15-turn branches, which we'll look at next. So here's the first group of 3 15-turn reforms. In military power, you get these 3 narrow and long reform trees that are 10 turns, 10 turns, 15 turns, 15 turns. And here we have 3 excellent units unlocked from these 3 reforms, as well as the level 5 or final upgraded versions of Iron Mine and Horse Pasture that you received earlier from the 10-turn reforms. Now the unit here that we want to highlight is the first 2 here. So the one on the left, I believe, is called Bringer of the Peace. This is the standard Yellow Turban unit you get in garrisons in the 182 start. They're unbreakable. So these are small unit size. I think they're only a quarter unit size. So if you're playing on standard or large, that's 120 for a regular size retinue. This one will be 30. And if you're playing on extreme, it's only 60. But because they're unbreakable, they buy you a lot of time, and they also use the axe, which makes them really good against shield units. The one in the middle here, Bastion of Change, is the Paragon of Huanglao, or I think they're called Huanglao's Paragon. It's one of those name combinations. But this unit is extremely cheap. It is also a smaller unit size, but it's only half unit size. but they have one of the highest base attacks in the game. I think their base attack is around 78. It's just unheard of. They clearly are these two-handed sword masters who has almost no defensive stat, but they're extremely cheap to recruit and they do a ton of damage. So I actually highly recommend you guys to take a look into these. If you thought my peasant focus attacks were strong, if you go after a Huanglao focus attack, they're going to be even stronger. They just tear into enemy early game units like crazy. You need armor stats that are probably above 50% to even slow these guys down. Now lastly, the pinnacle of the 15-turn reforms here in military power, we get 3 reforms that has no bonuses, just a unit and some enlightenment. These are your higher quality cavalry units, as well as this shield and mace unit at the end. So these are all high value units, very, very high morale, very high stats, but they're also very expensive in terms of research time, since you have to go through 2 sets of 10-turn reform and then another set of 15-turn before spending another 15-turn to get these. And we're going to take a look at that cost at the very end when we break down the reforms by the total amount of turns it takes to research them. So this kind of wraps up our military power discussion. And as you can see, we had these 3 long narrow branches that we just went over in order. And if we break these down again by the amount of turns it takes to unlock these, you'll see that this is actually a super expensive tree despite only having 18 reform, which is on the lighter side because we had 23 reforms from infrastructure and economy, and I believe 19 reforms from philosophy and trade. So here you start out with Yellow Sky Apprentice, which is your only 4-turn reform, and everything else builds from that. And at the very end, you notice the 3 sets of 20 turns, 3 sets of 30 turns, 3 sets of 45 turns, and 3 sets of 60 turns. So that's why the last 3 unit there are very expensive, because each of them to get there is going to cost you 60 turns, and to get all 3, 180 turns. Now, you could take into effect of percentage of research rate, which is actually really strong at reducing 15-turn reforms, because if you get it to about 160%, you're down to about 9 turns, which is very reasonable if you think about it. A 6-turn discount is pretty huge. So we'll talk about all that, how to get your reforms efficiently in part 4 when we talk about tips and tricks. But this is a good overview so far of military power, and this entire tree is definitely one that I highly recommend you to focus on at the beginning. Definitely think about going for General of the Flying Stones. It speed up your enlightenment, it speed up your campaign with trebuchets, and you can get strict adherence to the way. And I believe there's one more speaker of the leader's message. These are all early reforms that gives you your faction unique unit, gives you troop siege weapons, just unlocks a lot more gameplay with the 3 factions of the Zhang brothers. So moving on, we have Military Doctrine. These are also focused on the military side of your campaigns, but with a less emphasis on units, as these do not unlock new units. They unlock some military related buildings and provide some campaign bonuses. So let's jump into it with the 3 4-turn reforms here. So in terms of 4-turn reforms, the first reform you have to start out with is Mandatory Drill. This is actually typically the first reform I go for when playing as Yellow Turbans, because the 15% retinue upkeep is the saving that you could enjoy for the rest of your game. So the sooner you get it, the better it is. While getting the trebuchet might not benefit you right away if you can't afford it. So I typically go for Mandatory Drill first, and just that. I don't go any farther because the next 2 reforms you see here, regional factors and provincial coordinators, don't provide as much benefit to your campaigns. So go for Mandatory Drill as your first reform and then swap over to military power. Now, it's not saying that regional factors and provincial coordinators are not good. Well, regional factor is not good. You probably don't ever need 8 military supplies, but provincial coordinator is pretty decent because it gives you a full set of deployables, and you can definitely utilize those in your campaigns. But what's more important about these 2 reforms is that they continue into unlocking other reforms. Now, the 2 6-turn reforms you see here are originating from only the provincial coordinator. The regional factor will jump directly into a 10-turn reform, but these 2 here will provide you the building unlock, and recruitment drive particularly have some nice bonuses. 10% recruitment cost discount and 10% replenishment. So if you're not playing as Zhangjiao, who has ridiculous replenishment already, then Zhang Liang and Zhang Bao's faction might think about getting recruitment drives pretty early for both the discounted units as well as the 10% replenishment, and getting another building upgrade. I believe this is the labor building chain. It's pretty decent as well. Getting some industry income going always helps you out. Now moving on to 10-turn reforms, this is the bulk of the reforms here. You have increased storage, military fetcher, all giving you a bunch of county upgrades, as well as the industry building upgrades, basically focused on your purple buildings. Marching order gives you a military infrastructure building upgrade, as well as 25% campaign movement range in friendly sea regions. Not very useful. I wouldn't really recommend it unless you're hoping to get the next tier reform after it, which is campaign movement range on land, which is quite useful. Advanced training camps gives you another set of deployables, which is great, but also maybe not needed. No need to rush this, at least. Cross-provincial mustering reduces mustering time. Now this really depends on how good your replenishment is. If your replenishment is already really high, as in you have close to 50%, then getting 10% mustering isn't going to save yourself any time. Because if you get, let's say, -2 turns, which I think translate roughly to about 12% mustering speed when you can't move your army, if you're getting 50% replenishment and then additional 12%, you're at 62. That still requires that army to sit there for 2 turns to go to full. If, however, you are at 30%, then maybe that 12% or 18% you can get if you get other bonuses might speed you up much more. But it really depends on how much replenishment you have. So I wouldn't stress too much about the mustering turn bonuses. Lastly, we have 5 15-turn reforms. So advanced marching drill, we talked about marching drill earlier. If you want this 15% campaign movement range, which is definitely a solid bonus for Yellow Turbans, as not many of their characters have reach, but they do have their own effortless flow skill, which gives 10% to whole army, and you still can find some healers and veterans with the reach skill that gives 25%. This is just a nice quality of life bonus. It is a 15-turn reform, so it will take you quite a long time to get it, so there's definitely no rush for this. But in the late game, if you're picking from different 15-turn reforms, this is definitely one you should consider. Centralized conscription service is next. This is also a great reform because it gives you additional seasonal deployment limit, as well as the key -20% redeployment cost, which is this one bonus you're not going to find very commonly among the Yellow Turbans. So whereas you have a lot of leadership roles once you become an emperor with the imperial court, Yellow Turbans has a very different court structure with limited number of roles giving faction-wide bonuses. So it's unlikely for you to reach -100% redeployment cost. You can find 3 generals with flexibility, but it's going to be very hard to put them into the key roles to give you the bonuses needed to reach -100%. But it's not a big deal, and it's very late game focused. The +3 seasonal deployment is very nice to have, but unlike the bandits, which has no real way of gaining additional seasonal retinue deployment, Yellow Turbans can build the conscription building chain, and they can get additional seasonal retinue deployment from that building chain. So in a sense, you don't necessarily need to rush this to get more armies on the field or to flip generals around rapidly in a given turn. Next up, we have specialized supply lines. Nothing special about this. A nice county upgrade. I think this is the Jade Mine level 5. You get 30 points in Enlightenment on top of that. And then March of the Heavenly Way. This is a very useful one because it gives you 2 available armies. And this is probably one of the earlier ones you want to do because you get the level 4 upgrades for the mines. Whereas on the next reform, Expedited Deployment, you get the remaining upgrade options at tier 5. So between these last 3 reforms, March of the Heavenly Way definitely needs to take precedent, not only for the additional bonus of +2 available armies, but also for the prerequisite buildings for the other 2. So that kind of covers all our Military Doctrine reforms. And if we move on to look at the total turns it requires for these reforms, this one's quite balanced. There's not anything fancy with the turn timers. You have your 4 turns, 2 8 turns that builds off of that, and then you have your 2 6 turns that builds off the 8 turns, and then you have a few 18-turn reforms here. So these are the reforms that are attached directly to an 8-turn reform, so they kind of skip through the 2 14-turn reforms. Technically you can do things a little bit out of order, but the total amount of time it takes will not change very much. You still need to spend more total time for the 10-turn reform versus the 6-turn reform, but just not 10 turns more. Only 4 turns more because it does get to skip over an entire tier. So the structure of this tree is a little wacky. And then you have the 2 24-turn reforms. These build directly from the 14-turn reforms. And lastly, most of the 15-turn reforms require 39 turns. And that's going to do it for our part 3 of our reform guide. Definitely come back tomorrow. We'll be wrapping up this entire series by looking at tips and tricks, talking about how to plan out your reforms, which one to take first, which one are your key reforms, how to research your reforms efficiently, like what percentage of each reform rate is efficient at what level for what different tiers of reforms, and hopefully you guys will get to enjoy that as well. So thank you guys all for watching, and see you guys next time. Bye!